So hello, my name is Josephine Msindai, and today I'd like to present to you my research, which I undertook during my PhD studies while at the Department of Anthropology at University College London in the UK. So the title of my talk today is Lake Victoria's Chimpanzees, the Robondo Island Population, 50 Years Post-Rewilding. So just to situate the place where I worked, Robondo Island is located in the southwestern corner of Lake Victoria. It's within the territory of Tanzania, and it's one of the larger islands on Lake Victoria. The island itself is 237 square kilometers in size. Most of the island is actually forested, so 80% of it is forested, and the main dominant forest type is semi-deciduous trees, but there are also some evergreen trees on the island as well. On Robondo Island itself, there's a whole suite of native fauna that can be found there, including the rare swamp-dwelling Sitatunga, pictured here on the left. There are also other antelopes such as bush pugs, and there are also wild pigs, vervet monkeys, and a number of reptiles. On the lake shores, there are also hippopotamus and a large collection of crocodiles. So in addition to the suites of native fauna, there are also a number of animals that were introduced onto this island. One of those species are chimpanzees, and they're of particular interest to me. But before I discuss the introduction of chimpanzees onto this island and how they've adapted to living there, I would first like to introduce you to the main person in my story who's responsible for bringing some of these animals that were introduced to the island. So the person responsible for bringing chimpanzees onto Robondo Island is a man called Bernard Jimmick. Bernard Jimmick was trained as a veterinarian in Germany, and after World War II, he secured a position as the director of the Frankfurt Zoo. Later on, he would also become the director of the Frankfurt Zoological Society. Internationally, perhaps Jimmick is best known for his film The Serengeti Shall Not Die, which won him an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1960. So Jimmick was very good at using the new film and television media to gain popularity and to also raise funds for the Frankfurt Zoological Society. So after every clip of his famous weekly television program, A Place for Animals, he would often ask people to donate money to the Frankfurt Zoological Society and one of the other foundations that he founded. He was very much an influential figure in German-speaking countries, but also in East Africa. In fact, he was one of the trustees on the board of the Tanzania National Parks. But Jimmick's actions are very much embedded in the dynamics of colonization and decolonization. Jimmick very much romanticized Africa to his largely Western audience as a home of pristine wilderness. However, his animal paradise he portrays as being besieged by trophy hunters and the destructive actions of catch-up development, which was happening at that time in these newly independent nations. Very much so in a continuation of an old colonial trope, Jimmick labelled the supposedly untouched nature in Africa as an ideal possession for all mankind. And this is very much illustrated in the film The Serengeti Shall Not Die, where he says neither Black nor white people should touch these last living cultural treasures of Africa. So very much so the Serengeti Plains become a focus of Jimmick's interventions, and he urges the newly independent government to restrict access to local people into these national parks. He narrows down the problem to one of spatial conflict, but his demands very much echo sentiments from bygone times of before World War I, during Germany's expansionism program in Africa, but also later after World War I, the sort of the ideology that arose at that time of, in German, Lebensraum, or living space. Nevertheless, Jimmick finds an ally in Tanzania with President Julius Nyerere, who adopts his view that nature and that preserving these wilderness spaces is important for Tanzanian heritage. And very much so, Nyerere is convinced by Jimmick's argument that nature can be made to pay for herself by attracting tourists and therefore generating revenue. And that protecting these national parks, importantly, is for the benefit of everybody, so both for Tanzanians and for those who live elsewhere. What I'd like to say now is that the cost of nature can sometimes come at a price. And most notably, that price was suffered by those hundreds of local people, the Bunya and Urobondo people, who in 1960s were ejected and given very short notice to leave the island and their ancestral lands. The remnants of the human habitation on this island can be found to this day, including a school building that's in the south of the island. And that building had just been completed, its construction had just been completed about 2 months before these people were, for the most part, likely forcibly removed from Rubondo Island. In addition to the school building, there are also a number of fruit trees that produce fruits to this day, including lemon, mango, and avocado. Today, only park rangers and tourist lodge staff inhabit the island and a handful of researchers, which totals about 120 people. And I should mention that in 1977, the island was designated a national park. Between 1964 to 1990, there were a number of species that were introduced to the island. There was rhinoceroses that were translocated from other parks in Tanzania and moved onto the island. Unfortunately, the animals went extinct, possibly due to poaching. There are also a number of giraffes. Again, they were translocated from one area of Tanzania to Rubondo Island, and those giraffes seem to be doing fairly well. They number about 20 individuals today. There were also several roan antelope that were released, but unfortunately they're no longer found there. There were also some elephants that were released onto the island, and they were also translocated from another part of Tanzania. And today they number about 100 or so individuals and seem to be thriving in their new home. In 1967, there were also some black and white colobus monkeys that were released onto the island. We're not really sure why they were released there or where they come from. There were also 37 African grey parrots that were confiscated as they were part of the wildlife trade, and they were released onto the island. And I know there are perhaps some plans also into the future to release more animals that are, especially birds, that were confiscated from the wildlife trade. Jimmick used his network of zookeepers and zoo directors back home in Europe to gather about 17 chimpanzees from various nations in Europe. These chimpanzees had come from zoos, some had come from circuses, and a number had potentially also come from wild animal traders. He gathered 17 chimpanzees in the end, put them on a ship, and for 3 weeks they sailed to Tanzania from Europe. These chimpanzees had been living for anywhere between 4 months up to 9 years in captivity before they were set free on Rubondo Island. Unfortunately, during their voyage from Europe to Tanzania, one female died on the ship, and so only 16 chimpanzees were released in the end on the island over the 4 years, so between 1966 and 1969. The ages of the chimpanzees ranged from 4 years, so this is the time usually when chimpanzees are weaned, so these are sort of at the end of that infancy stage, up to 11 years. So none of the chimpanzees, as far as we can ascertain, were adults at the time of release. And this is detailed in my paper that was published this year in Primates. Across 4 years, and in 4 different cohorts, 9 females and 7 males were released onto the island. They had received no rehabilitation, which means they were not socialized into groups and made familiar with one another before being released. they had not been psychologically assessed. In fact, the reason why some of them were chosen to be released was because they were considered too dangerous to keep and had actually attacked several zookeepers back home in Europe. They did not receive any pre-release training. They were not acclimatized to the island prior to being released or introduced to forest foods for a period of time before being set free. It would what would be called today a hard release. So the day after they arrived onto the island, they were set free from their crates in the southern part of Robondo. The only sort of support that they were given was they were provisioned with human foods at their release site. We know very early on that the chimpanzees ate wild foods. This is because the food that they had been provisioned with, they didn't really eat. They didn't touch the food that was left there. And so the people who were left in charge to look after the island stopped provisioning them after 2 months. They didn't see a need. Perhaps also as well as eating wild foods, the chimpanzees may have well taken an opportunity and eaten some of the foods that were abandoned from the cultivated crops that the human inhabitants had left. Indeed, in Jimmick's book, published in 1970s, titled Animals of Africa, where there's a chapter about the Robondo chimpanzees, he talks about during that first release that there being a bunch of banana groves nearby to the release site. The first infants were seen in 1968. So the chimpanzees could start to reproduce quite early on post-release. But there was little post-release monitoring that was done, although attempts or plans had been made to do post-release monitoring. There were several reasons why the chimpanzees were not extensively studied after they were released. And one of the reasons for that was because the chimpanzees, or some of them at least, were extremely aggressive. In particular, there were about 1 or 3 males that tended to go to the human areas on the island and had a habit of raiding the food stores. Indeed, one particular individual called One-Eyed Jimmy had come to the human areas and raided a food store a couple of times, biting one of the rangers and taking his finger. On the sort of second or third incident, unfortunately, One-Eyed Jimmy was shot, and possibly another 2 or 3 other individuals might have also been shot as well during that time. Indeed, up to about 10 years, we know that the chimpanzees were sort of periodically aggressive to the rangers who lived on the island. So coming to this island, my objectives were really to try and understand the outcome of this rewilding experiment. We already knew at that time that the population was reproducing. And what I learned to learn more was to basically understand how the chimpanzees had adapted to living in the wild and to compare their behavior with native populations that had never lived in captivity before. An additional research question we had was to determine the geographic origin of the found individuals. So I should say at this point, when I came to do my research then, Robondo was 50 years past the introduction of chimpanzees. So I was conducting research on their descendants, the first and second generation descendants of those initial founders. So I came to conduct my research on Robondo Island from 2012 until 2014. At that time, the chimpanzees were not at all habituated to human observers. What that means is that it was very much difficult to find them on any given day and to track them and follow them and observe their behavior. For the most part, I relied on an indirect method of data collection. I gathered fecal samples, noted the location of fecal samples, as well as the location of indirect evidence such as nests, footprints, and occasionally we would come across chimpanzees as well. So we saw them over the course of those years about 146 times, and we noted down their group composition and took the GPS location when we came across them. Looked at was habitat use, social organization, and nesting patterns. And I'll just give you a brief overview of those results now. I won't go too much into the details, but you'll find that in sort of various publications that I have published. So in terms of their habitat use and their ranging, I found out that based on the locations of their night nests, these are the black dots here, and on direct observations as well, that they're utilizing something like 30% of the island. So they're ranging across this large area of the island, and around sort of 70 kilometers squared, if you use the minimum convex polygon method here. I also use the K-loco method, which is a kernel density estimate method, to basically understand the sort of the main areas or the size of the main areas that they're ranging in. And I found the sort of the main areas that they're ranging in are around sort of combined 41 kilometers square in size. In terms of their social organizations, it's based on direct observations and also on the size of their night nesting parties. I found that they had day parties of about a medium of 4 and night parties that had a medium of 5. So that's sort of within the normal kind of range at other study sites, where in general we tend to find that chimpanzees form larger parties at night, and they nest at night and then split up into smaller parties, which largely consist of a female and her offspring, and in the day when they go to forage. So this flexible grouping pattern is basically within the sort of normal range of chimpanzees. So we see that they've actually adapted quite well socially. And I just sort of should mention here that what the chimpanzees are, which I studied, are sort of the first and second generation descendants of the founders. In terms of their nesting construction behavior, I found that their nests are pretty much identical to that for other chimpanzees found in other parts of Africa. You couldn't really tell the difference between their nests and that from another population. And they had 1 or 2 preferred nesting trees. One of those nesting trees was Syncypalum brevipeps. So that they used that tree about 70% of the time, but it was not the most dominant tree species on the island. One of the other things that we were really interested to find out is to understand the geographical origins of the founder individuals of this population. So what we did is we collected fecal samples and then looked at the mitochondrial DNA. So we mainly focus on the matriline to understand which subspecies were released onto this island. And this study was undertaken by Christian Roos at the German Primate Center in Göttingen University in Germany. So just to give you a brief overview, first of all, so chimpanzees are divided into 4 subspecies, loosely based on their geographical locations, as you can see here on the map. So we extracted DNA, mitochondrial DNA, from 196 samples around 3 years after samples were collected. And looking at the mitochondrial DNA, which is, we looked at the matriline, we found that there were 3 haplotypes that came from Pan-Troglodytes virus. Those are shown here on the graph. And we also found 1 haplotype that was ascribed to PT troglodytes. So indeed what we found, we expected basically to find PT virus because we know from other studies, for example, by Tilecki, which I recall was published in 2001, that a lot of the trade in chimpanzees was done from West Africa into Europe. We were a little bit surprised to find the Central African chimpanzee Pan-Troglodytes. Indeed, what this means is that we now have a population of hybrid chimpanzees living on this island. That makes it quite controversial because if we were to repeat this experiment again, we basically would not be allowed to release 2 different subspecies onto this island according to the IUCN rules. But nevertheless, it makes for an interesting case in order to study how they've developed. Indeed, we believe the fact that they're of mixed subspecies origin may perhaps aid them, because it means that because they're a closed population, no immigrants can come in here, but because they come from disparate areas of West and Central Africa, we imagine it will be unlikely that they will suffer from inbreeding, at least in the near future. We currently found, based on some evidence using the direct observations of the chimpanzees, that there are about 35 individuals roughly living on the island at a minimum. What that means is that the population has increased by about 3.3% every year over the last 50 years. And compared to other well-studied chimpanzee populations, this one seems to be increasing, and it's increasing in number at about the same sort of rate as the Kibali chimpanzees that live in Uganda, which is a very good sign, because at many other well-studied chimpanzee sites where there's long-term data on population sizes, actually chimpanzees are declining in number. And that's why I mention here that some of our research can potentially prove to be interesting to find out what happens when we mix animals that are from different subspecies. There was a paper that was published by Eli and colleagues some time ago, which looked at the outcome and the survival rates of infants that had come from mixed subspecies of chimpanzee parents. And they found that their survival rates, at least in the first and second generation of infants, was higher for hybrids than it was for non-hybrids living in captivity. And it seems like for us as well, we have found that these chimpanzees are definitely at the moment not suffering from any outbreeding depression, just from this sort of preliminary results that we have looking at the growth of the population. So I would like now just to extend my gratitude and say a huge thank you to all the colleagues that I've worked with over the several years, including my supervisor, Volker Semmer, and my other colleagues as well in different institutes. So thank you all very much. And also to my wonderful team of trackers and field assistants that worked with me on the island over the course of these years. I thank them for their perseverance in what at times was a difficult field site to work in, where we occasionally would run into elephants and whatnot in the same area as the chimpanzees. Thank you.